Welcome. Today we will be interviewing Dr. Jackson Z of FOUR PAWS on accounting for animals in disaster response, planning, and resilience. This interview is part of a larger series hosted by the Animal Issues Thematic Cluster of the United Nations NGO Major Group in connection with the UN High-Level Political Forum, which is currently ongoing. Thank you so much, Jackson, for joining us today.
Thank you, Wolf, for having me and allowing me to participate.
So my first question for you is a very broad one. Why is it important to account for animals in disaster planning and response? How does harm to animals in disasters negatively impact people?
That's a great question. So wherever there is human settlements that are impacted by disasters, there's commonly animals that are impacted. Could be pets, could be farm animals, and if they live near nature, then it could even be wild animals. We see this across the world. So it's important to account for animals because animals have the high potential to suffer in disasters just like people can. So I think it's good to not only consider the human rescue and safety element, but we also require the animals or live with these animals to survive. So be it a farm animal, so the farmer needs his animals, and it's not always for food, it might be for tilling or something else, but how is that farmer going to recover? And if we advocate for strong animal welfare, like the compassion for that needs to sort of spread across. I have a lot of cases here with farmers, as you just spoke about, but with pet owners, particularly the elderly, vulnerable populations that have pets, but they treat them like family. And when, I worked with a wonderful lady, she unfortunately lost her cat during a flood. And when she couldn't get that cat back, what we noticed was with the Red Cross and through psychosocial first aid that she was depressed, clinically depressed, which also means that there's a higher potential for things like suicide, which we also see. Same thing with farmers. If you don't have a livelihood and you can't recover, we also see potential psychosocial risk to all these populations. And don't forget, most of them are either elderly or they are on the poverty line. So they're all vulnerable populations. Even for wildlife, wildlife workers, they protect wildlife as much as they can. And for them, it's a loss, so they feel it. And it's really important for us to consider animals in disasters.
What are some of the more tangible connections as in material losses or public health risks, livelihood losses that might result for people, for communities as a result of the deaths or suffering of animals in disasters?
So according to the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office, so the UNDRR, which works in conjunction with many research universities, and they analyze the insurance data, which is where a lot of this comes from. And what they recognize is for most disasters around the world, at least a third of it is due to agricultural loss, of which livestock, fisheries, forestry, and crops are all part of that. In different parts of the world, there are different percentages of loss. In Africa, it's as much as 75% due to livestock loss, which is a lot of lives of animals, as well as the massive impact on public health due to carcasses, to livelihoods and recovery, because they're not going to get this back, or it's hard for them to get it back due to, say, a drought. So the tangibles for public health are, other than the immediate disease aspect or access to safe, clean water, because now it's spoiled due to carcasses or dirty contamination from disasters. There's a high potential for things like the psychological costs for society that in some societies it's covered by government. The pressure on society, all these add up to these secondary costs that are due to the fact that animals may not have been in the planning or were not rescued or protected due to a disaster.
On the other side of the equation, besides how disasters impact animals, how does the presence of animals in a community and the ways in which they relate with people or are used and the ways in which they are treated affect that community's resilience when disaster strikes?
So that's a really great question. So what we talk about in disaster planning that includes animals is how do we build that resilience through proper planning and preparedness of the community. So planning is, so what would you do? Preparedness is the actual individual planning and what are my steps to do. So communities that I work with in India would say, if a flood comes, where would we move our animals to? How many animals do I have? If it's my wife and I, then how long would it take for us to move our cattle to high ground? So animals in the planning is an absolute must, is what we advocate for, because on the ground level, on the grassroots level, people live in a community that has animals in it, and it's very much tied together. And we have to plan for animals because they keep people going and surviving within our social context.
There's been growing recognition and growing acceptance of One Health as a paradigm that unites the issues of human health and those of animal health, recognizing the ways in which they're interlinked. One welfare is a companion concept that hasn't quite gained as much traction, but is a very important one in terms of acknowledging the interlinkages that you're discussing. Could you elaborate a little bit more on one welfare?
What
that means?
That would be great. Sure. So yeah, there's this amazing concept called One Health, and there's a few groups that we work with that deal with this, but they really deal in the detail of disease management, surveillance, and that's really important. It's a very important component of One Welfare. So the One Welfare brings in other disciplines like law, knowing that there might be legislation that has to be put into place to protect the community at large. But One Welfare looks at that human well-being, the animal welfare, and environmental health, because that all needs to be integrated in the management and the planning so that we can look at things like disasters to make sure that the entire community and all of our facilities are protected. One Health does that as part of it to make sure that the health component is protected, but then there's also the psychosocial health, there's business continuity, there's environmental questions about the loss of biodiversity due to disaster loss. So these are all the other components that need to come into play, and so that we as a society can live in a way that is more sustainable and more towards collective development.
Should One Welfare be seen as a component or an addendum to One Health, or is it a larger concept that includes One Health within it?
So this is up for a wonderful debate. I believe that One Health is a very big component of One Welfare. One Welfare is really a much bigger interdisciplinary frame where One Health is really looking at the human-animal health component as it relates to the environment. So with the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, we would look at it from that One Health standpoint, which would talk about monitoring, treatment, vaccine development, all of that within the context. But are we talking about the impact on farms, the impact on business continuity, supply chain systems, insurance systems, the locking down of people, and their sort of psychological well-being, and also things like infrastructure, travel, all of that is more within that one welfare context. For me, it's a bigger context and a bigger question of how we approach an unknown and how we address it for everyone's well-being and health.
Besides domestic animals, what role should protecting wildlife and ecosystems play in disaster planning and response?
So ecosystems, being that they tend to be fairly independent from animals in captivity, so either on farms where we take care of animals on farms, or in the companion animal setting where animals live with us in our homes, while the animals tend to live out in nature. Nature simply is affected by disasters. If nature is impacted, then we can have to consider things like carbon sink loss. We start looking at the whole larger question of global warming. We look at biodiversity loss as it relates to national heritage, the identity of communities. And so for me, even though disasters does not really, animals in the wild tend to be able to flee. So birds fly away, other animals can climb or run away, or they go deeper into the forest where it's protected. So forests are there to usually to withstand disasters. But when it doesn't, then we start looking at habitat destruction and recovery rates. An example would be Borneo. With the fires in 2015 in Borneo, virgin forest where orangutans live, Bornean orangutans live, became critical to their survival. And a stronger plan or a better plan about fire prevention and fire mitigation to protect the habitat, which has buffer zones for secondary forests, but the primary forests need to be protected. Otherwise, we will lose the orangutans to extinction. So there are many things on the planet that relate to this kind of situation that I can draw back towards how we plan, prepare, and mitigate disasters of various kinds to protect species and communities, and as we all try to survive.
Mm-hmm. On a more theoretical level, since you're using a few different terms, could you explain what you mean by preparation and planning versus mitigation, response, and resilience? What precisely do these terms mean in reference to the picture?
Okay, great. So I'm using terminology that's commonly used in disaster management, disaster and emergency management. There's something called a disaster management cycle, where something bad happens, we call it the event. Usually there is a response to it. So we go during, say, an earthquake to the bad place to rescue and save what we can. Of which afterwards there is the community's time to recover. So we assist in the recovery where people are getting back to normal, hopefully, and as safe as possible. The next step in that chain is called mitigation. What can we do to avoid this? So for things like earthquakes, we can change building codes. We can change traffic flow, population density. We can look at it from an animal point of view and say that there are rules for barn fires. How do we build barns? Is it the safest way to build them? Is this the best place to build them? And then the last bit is preparation. So the preparation is, if this happens again, what can we do? We can have a plan, we can educate the public, the government has to have legislation in place that protects animals. These are all the functions that we need to have in case it happens again. But for animals and disasters, honestly, most of the world, animals are not included in disaster legislation. And why is that important? Well, it's just because if animals are not listed in legislation, then the government doesn't have a budget or a dedicated government agency that is taking care of it. And that means no budget, no staff. So when a group like FOUR PAWS will come and say, we'd like to help you with the animals, they don't have an official remit. It's not in their policies or plans. They would love us to come in and assist, but they don't know where to place us, and they absolutely have no idea who we need to engage with under what frame and context. And that's why we advocate for the inclusion of animals into disaster legislation.
Are there any governments that you would highlight as having included animals in legislation or policy in a really meaningful and effective way currently?
Unfortunately, the answer is no. There are many governments who have implemented plans, but we also see some of the failings because animals are part of the plan and it's spoken about, but the implementation is incredibly challenging. In the US, as an example, there's something called the Pets Act of 2006 or 2005. It allows for companion animals to travel with their owners away from a disaster, and hotels are supposed to be able to accommodate evacuees. But it does not involve farm animals or wild animals. So that's a failing. Australia, who has an example where they include all animals, and it's great, but as we have seen with the Australian fires earlier this year, with wildlife, it's still a challenge when these disasters become so great. Where do they go? How do we address this? And is it really just a wildland fire issue? And what happens to the animals? Where do they go? And that's still not very clear. Now, they were able to do some protection for farm animals, and they were able to inform the public and their pets, but wildlife had a huge loss in Australia earlier this year. Many other countries include just livestock. India is an example of just livestock. Mongolia is another one that's only livestock. But then what happens to companion animals? Where do they go? And companion animals are not always allowed in human shelters because they're not socialized. So some people might be afraid of dogs or cats or might be allergic. So what are the plans for that? That isn't always clear. So there is multiple government units, and they just need to collaborate under one frame, which is the disaster frame. And that language isn't always very clear because that disaster frame is built from either military or fire, rescue services. So the language and the context might be outside of that sphere. So what do the veterinary authorities do? What does the wildlife authorities do? They all have very different ideas and plans.
Mm-hmm. This is another broad question, but you've talked some about the differences between addressing farm animals versus companion animals versus wild animals, and you've talked about a range of different types of disasters, since that itself is a very broad term. That could include fires, that could include flooding, that could include longer term things like drought. So what are some of the unique aspects of the issue for different types of disasters and different types of animals?
So we can address, let's talk about the animals first, and then we can talk about the hazard types. Animals, of course, because of how our communities relate to the different kinds of animals, the concentration or the population numbers of these animals would suggest different kinds of ways to plan, mitigate, prepare. If it's pets, typically people might have a pet or a few pets in their home, and depending on where you are, it might be quite a few pets. And then, you know, there are things that are pets, but then they also fall into other categories. So my friend has a horse for a pet or a pig for a pet. You know, are they a pet or are they a farm animal? So there's some weird crossovers. We use these categories as how they relate to individuals, people. So are they a companion? So they would fall into a slightly different frame because then the owner has a responsibility to, as being a responsible pet owner, of what they need to do to help take care of their animals in case they have to leave or if they decide to stay. For farm animals, then we talk about industries. Even if it's a small farm or it's a large farm, the numbers of animals might be bigger and smaller. However, the responsibility relies with the owner. Once again, and they might have a lot of staff to take care of certain situations. But they have, as an industry, have a responsibility to meet government laws and things about how the animals are kept, what kind of preparation they need to make, and what can they actually do within that context. And it varies from country to country. For wild animals, really, it goes back to what the government policies are. It's typically what we're talking about is some kind of protected area where there are wild animals that live there that potentially can be affected. Easiest one is fires. Fires drive, wildfires or forest fires or bushfires will drive animals out of a protected area and might end up in a community. So tigers, for example, or elephants. That's causing human-elephant conflict issue because animals then no longer have food access or safety access. So all of these play with each other. So just animals, we put them into these groups for context, but they live around human communities and they kind of interact with each other. But it's easier for us to address them in this way, just to understand their relation to us and how we can address those, depending on the laws and the national laws. For disasters that we had mentioned, different types of hazards, there are so many types, and the list is huge. Honestly, for the individual, it's seasonal, typically. Generally for storms and fires. For earthquakes, it's any time, depending on where you live. If you live around the Ring of Fire, there's always many geological shifts. But the only two options that people have is, should I stay or should I go? And what they have to do to be able to do that. If I stay, am I safe here? If I have to leave, when do I leave and where do I go? And how long do I need to prepare for? You know, things to have is all your documents, all your family members, including your pets, and things like having enough medication and food and water. Those are important things to have. In case you are separated from your family members or even your pets, to be reunited, you need to have some evidence because everybody's in chaos. It's easier if you had documentation that proved how things are linked and that you're linked to them, that you can be properly reunited.
Can you highlight examples of successful interventions to help animals during or after disasters, either by FOUR PAWS or other parties?
Sure, there are so many examples, even here at FOUR PAWS. We were able to intervene in Indonesia on the island, the Gili Islands in Lombok after an earthquake. Basically, the community survives on, the community has a lot of stray cats, as well as they survive with working horses. Many people unfortunately fled the island because they were afraid of a tsunami, as well as it was a very strong earthquake, so a lot of the buildings had collapsed. The horses are on the island because there are no motorized vehicles, so they are there to help move things. The horses, most of them were stallions, so that also means that the boys will fight with each other. And what they needed was safety. They had horses who were running free, about 400 of them on a tiny island in the dark with no electricity. which caused human safety concerns, as well as how is the community going to survive and then recover. So our job there was to provide emergency food, water, medical care, because some of the horses were injured during the earthquakes. And then we protected and saved as many animals as we could, which included horses, cats, some of the wildlife on the island, and many cows. But that allowed the community to recover. We help animals in India with storms, Myanmar with cyclones and floods. We have worked in places for drought, like South Africa, and looking at day zero. We have worked with fires in Greece and in Australia. So our work takes us everywhere to look at that human-animal connection and where we can help the community by helping the animals. Either it brings the community together or helps them recover faster. That's basically our focus, is to help communities through the animal welfare lens.
As natural disasters become more frequent due to climate change, what kinds of actions can be taken to prepare for that and to better protect the welfare of animals and people alike?
So we have seen evidence that climate crisis does seem to increase the frequency, the magnitude, and the duration of disasters. What people can do to mitigate their risk to be more resilient is to make a plan for yourself and your family. Governments need to make plans that include animals. And then you have to learn to be prepared. Other than that context of trying to be prepared, we all take actions to reduce our global carbon footprint. Everything from how much we travel, what kind of modes of travel we use, what we purchase and utilize, how we live. Our food choices are all ways that we can reduce our negative impact on the planet, and in doing so can help reduce the magnitude, frequency of disasters. What we've seen with the changes with the coronavirus earlier this year is when the world shut down, pollution was less of an issue, which is great. Our seasons seem to have a little more balance. Animals started to change a little bit, and we saw that some parts of the world where there were some disasters, that they were able to recover faster. So we believe that it's possible and it can be done, that there is a link, and that there's actions that can be taken to be able to reduce your carbon footprint and also help your disaster resilience.
And in terms of planning, is it possible to build community resilience against disasters that may come in the future as a result of climate change? Can that be predicted and prepared for?
So that is definitely the next stage of the discussion that's being had by various governments and disaster scientists. Is we started with event preparedness and response, and we moved to hazard type preparedness and response. So basically we started with, oh, let's just do this and that, like it's a fire, let's fix it. And then became, hey, look, hurricanes happen, so let's take care of hurricanes. And now we've shifted into a very much of a not hazard based, but we're looking at the dynamics of environmentally based or climate based, because the types of disasters that could happen will change. And that will drive what we can do to be better prepared.
And finally, since you've mentioned the role of consumer choices of reducing carbon footprints, given that animal agriculture is actually one of the leading drivers of climate change, and that the use of animals is linked to other environmental problems such as erosion, biodiversity loss, can changing the ways in which societies use animals itself be a meaningful way of reducing the risk of future disasters happening in the first place?
Would you repeat that question, please?
The question is essentially, can changing the ways in which societies use animals itself be a meaningful way of reducing the risk of disasters happening?
So we believe that it is possible through our life choices and how we treat, what we use, how we function, can have a strong potential for the reduction of the potential of catastrophic disasters. And in doing so, that means everything from, other than consumer choices, how we take care of animals, how we interact, how we plan our cities, where we plan those, what is the balance between development of green space. All those things will have an impact. I mean, we know things like wetlands and mangroves. They protect us from storm surges and from tsunamis or storms. With development and the removal of that habitat, we make communities susceptible to flooding and damage. Due to whatever the purpose. Now, we might be doing that because we're building cities, because people want to be near the beach. Or we might be doing that because we need more farmland. So those are really important choices that we as community members need to consider in how we change our environment and what the risks are.
Before we finish up, are there any additional issues, points regarding animals and disasters and community resilience that you feel are important to touch on?
Sure, I would love that. So here at FOUR PAWS, what we've done is we've developed some preparedness and planning documents that explain why animals are important for communities in disasters. And I would recommend, if people want to learn more, that they can go to our website, which is four-paws.org, and you go to the disaster relief page, and on there you'll see some brochures and some other information about how they can plan and be better prepared for all kinds of disasters. So at the end of the day, it's always going to be that famous song, should I stay or should I go? And that's what you're going to plan for. So I would say be safe, be prepared, and if you love your loved ones, you would have that plan and you would evacuate early.
Well, thank you so much, Jackson. This has all been really useful information. And I very much appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wolf. Thank you, to the Animal Issues Thematic Cluster for inviting me and the NGO major group. And I hope that everyone at the United Nations High-Level Political Forum 2020 will be able to consider that animals are really important in all facets of life and in sustainable development. In particular, animals in disasters are really important. So please don't leave them behind, and please consider them in your future planning. Thank you.
Thank you.